Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. I am Matty Dalrymple. I'm the author of the Ann Kinnear Suspense Novels and Suspense Shorts and Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. And I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the indie author. And this is my video series, What I Learned, where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest work. What did they learn from that work that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn from that work that they would like to share with their fellow readers? And so today I am here with Kristopher Zgorski. Hey, Kristopher, how are you doing?
Hello, Matty.
To give our viewers a little bit of background on you, Kristopher Zgorski is the founder and sole reviewer of the Raven Award-winning blog BOLO Books. Kristopher also writes a column on digital crime fiction resources for every issue of ELLERY QUEEN Mystery Magazine. Kristopher resides with his husband in Columbia, Maryland, and his story Ticket to Ride, which he co-authored with fellow blogger Drew Ann Love, is one of 17 stories in the collection based on songs by the Beatles, Happiness is a Warm Gun. And so today I am asking Kristopher the 2 What I Learned questions about Ticket to Ride and Happiness is a Warm Gun, starting with what did you learn from that work that you would like to share with your fellow writers?
Thanks, Matty. The interesting thing is that when Drew and I went into this, of course, we're coming from a background of having been reviewers. So some of this was innately stuff that we knew beforehand, but we didn't really know we knew just from reading. But the thing I want to focus on here is point of view and tense. We started out with a story that we knew was going to be set in 2 time periods, the present and a past event that had happened. So we innately knew that the present tense should be used in the now periods and the past tense should be used in the past. And this helps to distance the reader from the past events and makes the immediate stuff more real and visceral. So it was just interesting how difficult it was to write in the present tense. It's not something that feels natural to us, and I don't think it feels natural to many people. So those sections we struggled with, but the payoff was really worth it in the end. So I was really happy that we made that decision. And like I said, we didn't really consciously do it. We just sort of knew that needed to happen. But once we were doing it, I'm like, this is really difficult. So we had definitely more editing problems in those sections, in the now sections, than we did with the past. But like I said, the payoff in the end, I think we've had several readers tell us that Ticket to Ride has made them cry at the end. And I think that's because of the present tense immediacy of those final scenes that happened in the story in the present day. So I'm glad we did it. And I don't know if that helps anybody, but it just is to think about that. And then the other thing is point of view, which we did not succeed with at the beginning. The early drafts of Ticket to Ride were all written in third person. And that was because Drew and I were 2 different people collaborating on a story. So the I just didn't seem like the way to go. So we did third person, and that felt natural to us. And we wrote it. We were very happy with the story we ended up with. And then when we turned it into our editor, Josh Pachter, he came back and he loved the story, but he said, I really think it would be a better story in the first person. And he said that, first of all, it better reflects the story. I mean, the song, the Ticket to Ride that the story is based on, the Beatles song. So since that's in first person, he thought, I think it makes sense to have the story in first person. But then he also thought that it would bring the reader closer to Lester, the narrator of the story. So at that point, very late in the process, we had already written several drafts. We completely changed gears and wrote in first person. And happy to say that Josh was right. It is a better story this way. It's a different story. We were able to edit some things out that made it a tighter story because of changing the perspective. So both those 2 things, I would say, just always be conscious of why you're choosing the point of view you're choosing, and is it the best one for the story? And then look at your tenses and see if there's another way you can play with them to make the story a little more effective.
I think that's a great example of how editors can bring an eye, even for the most experienced writers, that there's just something that you don't see because, you go into it with one set of expectations and you need a professional second set of eyes to look at it, or in your case, a third set of eyes to look at it and say, hey, did you think about this? And I think one of the most interesting tense stories I ever heard was I was interviewing one of my favorite authors, who's Ben Winters, for the Indie Author Podcast. He's written like The Last Policeman series and Underground Airlines and lots of great books. And we were talking about The Last Policeman, which is about a policeman who is going to be the last policeman because I think the backstory is there's a meteor headed for Earth. And, as soon as it hits, then that's the end of humanity. And he, as I understood it, finished the entire draft in past tense and then realized that writing about an earth-ending event in past tense was very weird. Like, it sort of
Yes.
it almost seemed to not telegraph, but suggest that there was going to be a future from which one could look at the events from a past tense, and so then he had to go back and rewrite the whole thing in
That's
present
really
tense.
interesting. It's a great story. I mean, it's a great novel. I love that novel. So that is
Yeah.
interesting. But yeah, I could see how that would give the reader an expectation that is not really possible. If a meteor is going to hit the planet.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing that I think as a writer, again, you don't see yourself, like you're writing along and you know what you're intending to do, and it takes somebody else looking at it and saying, there's like a weird logic thing going on here.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it was great. And it was obviously, since it's our first published story ever, it was our first experience working with an editor. And Josh was great. I mean, has done several of these inspired by anthologies. This one inspired by the songs of the Beatles. And he guided us very well, and we were happy with his input. And I think the story is better for it.
Yeah. So you had some great tips there to share with your fellow writers. How about your fellow readers? What lesson did you learn that you'd like to share with them?
Yeah, I would like to say that we all as readers have our niche that we love, and we try to focus on that, and it's our comfort place. I mean, reading is an enjoyment thing. So people always just want to go with what they're normally reading. So if you love cozies, you're looking for cozies. If you love it historical, you seek those out. If you love noir, which is a darker kind of thing, maybe that's what you're looking for. And I would just say that these kind of anthologies that are coming out, Happiness is a Warm Gun, the crime fiction inspired by the Beatles, and the others, give you an opportunity to dabble into other readings that you wouldn't normally do without committing to a whole novel. So I think that they're really great for that, because I think we're better readers if we expand our horizons. But it also can be uncomfortable to go on those places that you're not used to or that you don't enjoy. And even could go backwards, because usually it's like the cozies don't want to go dark because they just don't like dark. And that's perfectly fine. But it also goes the other way. I mean, noir readers and fans, people who like darker stuff, really don't ever try the cozy stuff. And there's a lot to be learned from those cozy novels, and how great they are, and the way they're able to get the same feelings across without using those graphic elements. So I would just encourage every reader to, if you're not comfortable going with a whole novel, then try some of these anthologies, and you get a whole wide span. I mean, there's historical stories in this collection. There's darker stories. Even Drew and I's story, people thought it was going to be much cozier than it is. It's it's not a dark story, but it's definitely a heavier story than people would have expected, especially from Drew. So I pushed her in that direction. The writing, but it served the story. Story needed to have that, to have the impact. And obviously, like I said, if people are telling us they're crying at the end, I think we succeeded in what we wanted to do. So that's what I would say. I would just say, give yourself a short story that's outside of your realm before you're diving into a novel, because that can be too much. And maybe you'll never read novels, but maybe if you read some of the darker short stories, you'll at least see that perspective. And if you read some of the cozy short stories, you'll understand why people are drawn to that. And it just makes us better readers, I think.
That's both a great lesson for readers, but also for writers, I think, because as a big fan of talking about the business of short fiction, one of the things I often mention is the idea that if you're, for example, in a writers group that's focused on a particular genre, like I belong to Sisters in Crime and international thriller writers, then groups like that can often pull together their own anthologies with stories based on that. But this idea that you don't have to be tied to looking just for genre-specific anthologies, as you're mentioning with Happiness is a Warm Gun, which sounds like it has representation across lots and lots of different genres, with the commonality, the thread being the Beatles songs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it just is. And you're right, for writers too, because if you want to write something that's different, if you have a cozy idea, but you're like, oh, well, I never write cozy, that will never work, then try it as a short story and see if you can do it. And then you can experiment with that, because your brand can be wider than you think it's going to be. I mean, some of my favorite writers write across subgenres. So it's a good exercise. Even if you don't do anything with it, it's a good exercise to try it, I think. And then you just see this perspective from the other side.
Yeah, I wrote a story for an anthology. It was not picked up for the anthology, but I had a lot of fun writing it. And the theme was the bad guy wins and profanity is encouraged. And sometimes
exactly the opposite of cozy.
Yeah, and sometimes the bad guy does sort of win in my books, but there's usually not a ton of profanity. But it was actually fun to write that. And then I put it up for sale on the retail sites, and I actually put a note saying, This is what the assignment was for the anthology. You have been warned, so don't complain to me you know, if I'm dropping the F-bomb more than I normally do.
There you go. It's all about experimenting and doing different things. So it's fun. And I think it makes us both better writers and better readers.
Yeah. I did want to loop back on one thing you said right at the start, which was that you didn't know how much you already knew. And just looping back briefly to the questions about what you might have learned that you'd want to share with your fellow writers, are there any examples you can think of where you started in and you thought, oh, I actually, I have a pretty good handle on this?
Well, I think that in the early chapters, because it's a flashback and the traumatic incident that's the core of the story happens in the past, we knew right from the first section that we were writing that are set in the present that we needed to allude to that event right away, immediately, because we couldn't wait, even though it's a short story and it happens fairly rapidly. We just couldn't wait past the first few paragraphs to let the reader know that something big was coming. And I think that's important in any story. You just want your action to be right there. There was no reason to have that early section if we didn't hint at it, what was coming. But we needed that early section to set the scene and to let our readers know who our characters were and where they were in their lives at that moment. So something like that is something I think comes from my reading. I think because we've been reviewing books for so long and stuff, I know the immediacy of getting right to the action and not filling a whole lot of backstory. So, and you wouldn't do that in a short story anyway, but I think that comes from that. It just is like when you're reviewing stuff, you're looking at stuff critically in a different eye than you would as just a relaxed sitting back reader. And I think that that's what we brought, what came out while we were writing it. And I think is why, hopefully, I mean, we're hearing positive reviews. Hopefully we were successful in doing this. It was not an easy thing. I don't think I would ever recommend that a person take their first short story and make it a collaborative effort because it's already difficult enough. And now you have two voices that are working. And thankfully, Drew and I know each other so well that we were able to work together and it worked beautifully, but it's just not something I would suggest as a first writing experience for most people.
Yeah, I recently did my first co-written fiction piece, which was with Jane Gorman, who's the author of the Adam Kaminsky mystery novels. And Adam Kaminsky is a Philadelphia detective. My stories are based in Philadelphia. And before I knew Jane and was familiar with her books, I had written the early Ann Kinnear books, and Ann has a former boyfriend named Dan Kaminsky. And so when I read the Adam Kaminsky books, I at that point, I knew Jane through Sisters in Crime, and I said, we have to have a story where Ann meets Dan's, let's say, cousin, Adam. And we just did that recently. It's available. If people sign up for our email newsletters, they get a copy of the Ann Kinnear and Adam Kaminsky short story, Blood of the Wicked. But it was easier because it was 2 points of view. Like we would have a little scene with Ann's point of view and a little scene with Adam's point of view. And so, each of us was more or less writing that. But it was really interesting because we had to, we didn't even have a starting point like a Beatles song. It was like we had to think of a setting and a plot and a scenario that would make sense for both of them. So it is a very challenging, much more challenging, I think, than nonfiction co-writing.
Yeah, I think nonfiction co-writing is probably a little easier because you're not so much focused on voice. I mean, it's hard to get a singular voice when you have two people writing. And like I said, since it was both of our first story ever, that was a challenge we would have had even or just writing by ourselves. So now we suddenly have a struggle to find a voice and find a voice collaboratively. So we were sort of committed to it before we even thought about it. So we were determined that we were going to get it done and do it. And I think that pushed us, that deadline and commitment forced us to make it work. And like I said, we did go through many, many, many drafts. I mean, probably more drafts than the average person does for a short story, I would think. I have no idea really. But for us, it was a lot of drafts and 2 beta readers that read it early on that gave us different kinds of feedback, macro and micro stuff. So I think that those are important too, especially for newer writers. I think you can't underestimate a beta reader who can look at it fresh and say what is good and what's not and what's working, and just give you some pointers on where they felt it dragged, so you can edit that and make it better. So yeah, I think, like I said, I wouldn't recommend it for most people as a first time, but it worked for us. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everybody should write collaboratively first.
Well, it sounds like it was a great experience for you guys, and it sounds like it will be a great experience for your readers based on your editor's input, your beta reader's input. So, Kristopher, thank you so much for coming to talk about your story for Happiness is a Warm Gun. Where can people go to find out about it and your story and you online?
Thanks so much, Matty. It's available from Down and Out Books, so you can go to their website and search Happiness is a Warm Gun or Josh Pachter, and you can find it that way. He's the editor of the collection. And of course, it's available at all your online retailers as well. So you can order there. And I hope people will check it out and let us know what they think. There's some really good stories in there. I hope our story is great, but there really are some really strong stories in the collection. So it's worth checking out. And who doesn't love the Beatles?
Exactly. Thank you so much, Kristopher.
Thanks, Matty. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.